When a young mother suffering from addiction is deemed unfit to parent, she makes one final plea to hold her son one last time before he's taken away. She clings to him, whispering promises she knows she may never keep, and then in an instant he's gone. But fate has a way of rewriting stories in the most unexpected ways. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe in second chances, hit like and subscribe for more. Please, Your Honor, I swear I'll do better. Amelia's voice cracked desperation. Clawing its way up her throat, she took a staggering step forward, hands clutching the edge of the defendant's table, as if she could physically hold on to hope. Judge Williams barely spared her a glance as he continued reading from the file. Before him, his expression impassive. Miss Davis, the court has carefully reviewed your history, including multiple failed attempts at rehabilitation, unstable living conditions, and reports of neglect. That's not true. Amelia's outburst cut through the air raw and ragged. I never neglected him. I love my son. Please, I just need more time. Miss Davis, the judge's voice hardened. The facts stand. You have been found unfit to parent. Effective immediately, the court grants custody of your child to the state. He will be placed into foster care with the intention of permanent adoption. Amelia felt the words like a physical blow. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, whispers from distant relatives who hadn't lifted a finger to help her, from strangers who had already judged her. Her knees buckled, but she forced herself to stay upright. Please, she rasped. He's all I have. A woman stood quietly at the side of the room, holding the 2-year-old baby in her arms. The social worker. Amelia had barely noticed her at first, but now her presence was suffocating. Her sweet little boy was oblivious to the gravity of the moment. He clutched his stuffed rabbit to his chest, his round cheeks flushed from the warmth of the crowded courtroom. Her brown eyes darted around, taking in the sea of unfamiliar faces. He wasn't crying. He didn't understand. Amelia pressed a shaking hand against her mouth. The judge exhaled, his face softening ever so slightly. He tapped his gavel once, signaling finality. This hearing is concluded. The wooden doors creaked open. It was happening. No, 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 no. Amelia's legs finally gave out, and she sank to the floor, arms wrapping around herself. This couldn't be real. They were taking him. They were taking her baby. 2 officers stepped forward, speaking in low, practiced voices meant to sound comforting, but there was no comfort to be found. The boy turned his head at the sound of Amelia's cries, curiosity flashing across his small face. The sight of his mother on the floor seemed to confuse him, his little brows drawing together. She couldn't let this be the last thing he saw of her. Gasping, Amelia scrambled forward on her hands and knees, grabbing the hem of the social worker's sleeve. Just let me hold him, she sobbed. Please, just one last time. A long silence followed. Even the officers had hesitated. Judge Williams ran a wary hand down his face before giving the slightest nod. The social worker hesitated, then gently, so gently she bent down and placed Oliver in Amelia's trembling arms. The moment her son was in her grasp, Amelia let out a broken sound, something between a sob and a prayer. She pulled him close, breathing him and pressing kisses against his soft curls. Baby, my sweet boy, she whispered, her tears wetting the top of his head. I love you so much. He giggled, pressing a chubby hand to her face. Mama, he babbled, not knowing that this was goodbye. A fresh sob ripped from her throat. She keyed his tiny face, memorizing every inch of him, the warmth of his skin, the way he fit perfectly in her arms, the scent of baby shampoo mixed with the faintest hint of powdered milk. He was her heart, her everything. She wanted to tell him everything, that she was sorry, that she had tried, that she would get better, that no matter what happened, she would never stop loving him. I'll find you, she choked out. I swear I'll find you again. Then too soon. The social worker stepped forward. Amelia's grip tightened instinctively. No, she whispered, shaking her head. Not yet. But there was no stopping it. A gentle but firm hand rested on her arm. Miss Davis, the social worker said softly, it's time. No, not yet. Please, just one more minute, just one more second. But she had no more time left. She clung to her son until she physically couldn't anymore. The moment his small arms were pulled away from her, something inside her broke. Her hands grasped at empty air, her body crumpling forward as if the loss had drained the very strength from her bones. She barely registered the muffled sounds of people moving, of the doors opening wider. The social worker adjusted the baby on her hip. He turned his head, wide brown eyes finding Amelia's crumpled form on the floor. He didn't cry, but his little hands reached out. Amelia sobbed so hard she thought her body would collapse in on itself. The courtroom doors slammed shut, and just like that he was gone for a long time. Amelia didn't move. She stayed there, curled on the cold tile floor, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. The sounds of people exiting the room, of quiet discussions between lawyers and court officials, blurred into white noise. Someone placed a hand on her shoulder. One of the officers maybe, but she barely felt it. Her world had ended in that room in that moment. Somewhere in the back of her mind, through the haze of grief, a single thought remained: she would get better, she would do whatever it took, and one day somehow she would find him again. The click of Oliver Davis's polished shoes against the marble floor carried through the open hallway. His stride measured, his presence commanding. The office buzzed with a quiet urgency. His urgency employees moved with purpose, adjusting their pace. When they noticed him coming, no one wanted to be the reason. Oliver Davis's notoriously sharp were thin inside the boardroom. The air was thick with the weight of expectation. PowerPoint slides glowed against the glass walls, figures and projections meticulously laid out in the latest proposal. The junior executive sat stiffly waiting for his verdict. Oliver sat at the head of the long table, fingers tapping lightly against the surface. His sharp blue-gray eyes skimmed the details on the report in front of him, expression unreadable. Then without lifting his gaze, he spoke. "This is weak." The tension in the room spiked. No one moved. A junior partner shifted in his chair, clearing his throat. "Mr. Davis, we've run the numbers extensively. The projected ROI is a joke." Oliver finally lifted his head. "These figures assume an aggressive market shift with zero risk mitigation. You're making decisions on hypotheticals instead of actual performance." He pushed the file aside. His movements clicked. "Final, redo it." Silence, then the quiet scraping of chairs as the team hurriedly battered their materials. Nodding, murmuring, rushed agreements. No one argued. They never did. As the meeting dispersed, Oliver stood, buttoning his suit jacket with a precise, practiced motion. He had worked his way into this room through sheer force of will, cutting through the industry like a scalpel. And he had no patience for mediocrity. Stepping out into the corridor, he turned toward his office, mentally shifting to the next task until he stopped abruptly. A sharp splash. His eyes flicked down. A dark pool of murky water had spread across the pristine white marble, seeping toward his expensive leather shoes. A janitor, a flustered man in a navy uniform, stood frozen, gripping a mop handle like it was a lifeline. The overturned bucket spun slightly before settling. For a second, no one spoke. The entire corridor seemed to hold its breath. Oliver's expression didn't shift, but his voice came cold, even unbelievable. The janitor swallowed hard. I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't see if you could handle a mop." Oliver cut in, his tone crisp as glass. "Then maybe you shouldn't be working here." The sting of the words landed instantly. The janitor nodded stiffly, already scrambling to fix the mess several feet away. Amelia Parker watched. She had been wheeling her cleaning cart past the break room when she heard the exchange. Stopping just outside the scene, her grip tightened on the spray bottle in her hand, watching away. The then executive stood over the janitor with that impatient, superior look. She had seen men like this before. "Entitled, cruel, powerful," she scoffed under her breath. "Entitled prick." Oliver's head turned slightly, his sharp gaze flickering toward the sound, but Amelia was already pushing her cart forward, moving past the scene like she had better things to do. Later that evening, the office had emptied out, leaving only a skeleton crew, overnight security, the janitorial staff, and Oliver Davis still at his desk. His office was dim except for the glow of the city skyline stretching beyond the vast glass windows. The once pristine desk was now a battlefield of scattered reports, his laptop screen blinking with an unfinished email. A sigh escaped him as he rubbed the bridge of his nose. Long nights were nothing new across the office floor. Amelia moved with routine efficiency, emptying waste bins, wiping down surfaces, and avoiding eye contact with the remaining employees. Then came the worst part of the shift, cleaning the executives' offices. She entered Ali's office with little thought, pulling her cart behind her. The faint smell of expensive cologne and paper filled the space. She didn't glance at him, moving straight to the waste bin. She had just bent down when her hip bumped into the corner of his desk, and before she could steady herself, a stack of neatly arranged reports slid off the surface, spilling across the floor. The sound snapped Oliver's attention upward. His chair swiveled sharply toward her, irritation immediate and unmistakable. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Amelia straightened slowly, unbothered by his tone. "Trying to do my job," she shot back, bending down to gather the scattered papers. "Which, by the way, would be a lot easier if you didn't leave your crap everywhere for a second." There was silence. Most people shrank under Oliver's scrutiny. Employees stumbled over apologies, avoided eye contact, fumble what to fix their mistakes. But this woman, this janitor, held his gaze without flinching. Oliver's irritation deepened. "Just clean up and get out." Amelia gave him a look, unimpressed, before muttering, "Arrogant suits." Oliver's jaw ticked. He didn't reply, didn't react beyond a flicker of mild disbelief. Instead, he simply turned back to his laptop, pretending she no longer existed. Amelia didn't spare him another glance. She finished her task, dumped the last piece of trash into the bin, and pushed her cart back into the hallway. But as she left, a strange feeling tugged at her chest. Something about the way he held himself, the sharpness of his features, nagged at her like she had seen him before, like he was familiar. She shook the thought off. No way. Oliver sat still for a long moment after she was gone. His irritation should have faded, but it hadn't. Something about her, the way she spoke to him, the complete lack of hesitation in her tone, it unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite place. She wasn't afraid of him. That wasn't normal for a man used to control. The feeling was deeply unsettling. Was Oliver's attitude toward Amelia out of line? Should custodial staff be treated with the same respect as executives? Or was his reaction justified? Drop your thoughts in the comments, leave a like, and keep watching to see what happens next. I'm telling you, the man has no soul. A comment was followed by a quiet snicker, then the soft clatter of spoons against ceramic cups. Amelia stood a few feet away, wringing out her mop near the break room sink, listening as a group of employees gathered by the coffee machine. They spoke in hushed tones, but the acoustics of the tiled room did little to hide their conversation. I wouldn't say no soul, one of the women countered, stirring sugar into her coffee. Brutal maybe, but he gets results. I seen him tear into junior associates but then turn around and personally groom the ones who survive it. No one gets to the top without getting past him first. A man shook his head. Yeah, if you work directly under him, but for the rest of us he's got zero patience. Doesn't even look at the people who keep this place running. Another woman chuckled. Not true. He looked at me once, thought I was someone important, then walked right past when he realized I wasn't around. Of quiet laughter rippled through the group. Amelia bit back a scoff as she dragged the mop across the floor. Figures, it was always the same type, privileged, polished men who built their names on cold deficiency and saw the world in dollar signs instead of people. She had encountered them before, on the streets, in courthouses, in the places that had swallowed her whole before she fought her way back out. Men like Oliver Davis never noticed people like her. And if they did, it was only to remind them that they were beneath them. Amelia didn't linger to hear the rest of the conversation. She had a job to finish, and she wasn't about to waste her energy thinking about some arrogant businessman who would never give her the time of day. The break room was empty when Amelia returned later that afternoon, pushing her cleaning cart inside. She liked it better this way, quiet, no lingering employees waiting for their turn at the coffee machine. No sidelong glances as she mocked around their feet. She was nearly done when she reached for the freshly brewed coffee pot, intending to wipe down the counter. Then the door swung open behind her. The sound startled her just enough that her grip slipped, sending a full cup of scalding coffee cascading down the front of a tailored charcoal GRY suit. Silence, a slow, dangerous silence. Amelia's hand was still frozen in midair, watching as the steaming liquid seeped into the fabric, dripping under the pristine floor. She slowly lifted her gaze. Oliver Davis stood rigid, his expression unreadable, the shoulders tensed beneath the soaked material, and his cold blue-gray eyes flickered from the mask to her face, a sharp exhale flaring his nostrils. Amelia lowered the cup to the counter and braced herself while she muttered, "Guess she should have announced herself." Oliver's jaw ticked. He inhaled through his nose, exhaling slowly, controlled. "Are you really that incompetent?" Amelia tilted her head, feigning consideration. "Are you really that much of an ass?" Something flickered behind his gaze, amusement, annoyance, she couldn't tell, and she didn't care. A long, tense beat stretched between them. She expected him to snap, to reprimand her with the same cold ruthlessness she had witnessed earlier. Instead, Oliver stepped back, his voice quiet but sharp as a blade. "I don't have time for this." Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the break room, the wet stain clinging to his suit jacket as he disappeared down the hall. Amelia stood rigid in place, fingers curled against her arms, heart pounding, not from fear but from rage. What an arrogant, self-important bastard. The anger followed her throughout the rest of the day, as she scrubbed out stains, emptied trash bins, and vacuumed empty hallways. She replayed the encounter over and over in her mind. Who the hell did he think he was? She had met men like him before, thought she had left them behind when she rebuilt her life from the ashes. But there was something about this one that unsettled her in a way she couldn't shake. It wasn't just his tone, his attitude, or his unwavering sense of superiority. It was something else, something she couldn't quite put her finger on, and it nagged at her for the rest of the evening. Even after she left work and took the long bus ride home, the rain tapped softly against the window pane, the dim glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across Amelia's tiny kitchen. The smell of instant coffee lingered in the air, untouched. The mug beside her long gone cold. She sat hunched at the table, hands resting on the worn cardboard edges of an old shoebox. For years she had avoided opening it. She had told herself that keeping the past buried was the only way forward, that digging up ghosts wouldn't change anything. But tonight was different. With slow, deliberate movements she lifted the lid. Inside lay the remnants of a life she had once known, a small faded baby blanket, its soft blue fabric worn from time, a pair of tiny sneakers barely scuffed because Oliver had been too little to walk when they took him from her, and at the very bottom Tucked beneath court documents and hospital papers, a photograph. Her fingers trembled as she lifted it. There he was, baby Oliver, barely a year old, grinning up at the camera with chubby cheeks and bright mischievous eyes, the same sharp thoughtful gaze that had never quite belonged to a child so young. Her throat tightened. She ran her fingertips over the image, tracing the shape of his face. The memory came fast and unbidden, Oliver's tiny giggle as she kissed his cheeks, the way he would clutch onto her shirt when he was tired, his small body pressing into hers as he dozed off in her arms. Amelia shut her eyes. She had lost all of it, but she had survived. She had clawed her way back to life, to sobriety, to something resembling stability. And now she was seeing those same eyes again. Her gaze snapped open. Shifting toward the other end of the table, a manila envelope lay there, its corners curled for Mage. She pulled it closer, fingers shaking as she pried it open. Inside was a worn document from the foster agency, the same one that had handled Oliver's placement. She had held onto it all these years, tucked it away in case she ever found the courage to look for him, and now after all this time she had stumbled across him without even trying. Her breath hitched, her hands gripped the paper tightly as the details swam before her eyes. The date of placement, the sealed adoption record, a name she had been too afraid to look up for decades. Davis. Her chest constricted painfully. Oliver Davis. She covered her mouth, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. It was him. It had to be. At work, Amelia had started noticing things. She had tried to brush them off as coincidences, as tricks of the mind, but now she couldn't ignore it any longer. The way Oliver carried himself, his mannerisms, the sharp way he spoke, the way his brow furrowed when he was deep in thought, and most of all, the scar, a small barely noticeable line on his chin tucked beneath the sharp angles of his jaw. She had spotted it in passing, a fleeting glimpse when he turned his head during a conversation. It was faint, but it was the same scar Oliver had gotten as a toddler when he tripped and fell against the corner of a coffee table. She remembered the day vividly, the sound of his cry, the blood against his soft skin, the way she had panicked as she pressed it held to the wound, rocking him back and forth, whispering that everything would be okay. Her son had a scar on his chin, and so did Oliver Davis. Amelia swallowed hard, hands gripping the table as if it would stop the ground from shifting beneath her. It couldn't be a coincidence, but it was impossible, wasn't it? She let out a shaky breath, squeezing her eyes shut. Maybe she was wrong, maybe she was losing it, convincing herself of something that wasn't real, and yet she turned back to the photograph of baby Oliver, staring into those same familiar eyes. Her heart pounded violently against her ribs. Tomorrow she was going to the foster agency. She needed to know. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scented damp pavement and the distant hum of city life. Amelia stood in front of the foster agency, her pulse hammering against her ribs. This was it. She had spent the entire night tossing and turning, the weight of suspicion and desperate hope pressing down on her chest like an anvil. Every logical part of her brain had told her to stop, to let it go before she shattered herself against a truth she might not be ready for. But logic had no place in this. She had to know. Drawing in a steadying breath, she stepped through the glass doors and into the dimly lit office. The scent of stale coffee and old paperwork wrapping around her. The place hadn't changed much in 25 years. The same faded bulletin boards lined the walls, cluttered with resources for struggling families. The front desk was different, but the weight of her last visit here, the worst day of her life, settled over her like a heavy coat. A receptionist, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes, looked out. "Can I help you?" Amelia hesitated for a half-second, then forced herself forward. "I need to look up an old case, a child placed into adoption about 25 years ago." The receptionist frowned. "We don't typically release that kind of information without legal authorization." Amelia gripped the strap of her bag, steeling herself. "I understand. But this isn't just anyone. This was my son." The woman blinked, studying her for a moment, then exhaled through her nose. "Wait here." Amelia sat stiffly as the woman disappeared into a back office, her fingers twisted together in her lap, her leg bouncing beneath the table. Every second stretched, dragging time into something unbearable. Then footsteps. A woman emerged, a supervisor dressed in a neatly pressed blouse and slacks, her expression unreadable. She carried a SL file. "Miss Davis." Amelia shot to her feet. "Yes." The woman gave a slight nod before glancing down at the folder in her hands. "I pulled what I could. The records are sealed beyond a certain point, but this is what I can confirm." She opened the file, her next words shattering the last remnants of Amelia's doubt. "Oliver Davis placed with Robert and Helen Davis in a closed adoption." A ringing filled Amelia's ears, her throat went dry. Davis. She barely registered the rest of what the woman was saying, words about the adoption being finalized quickly, the foster agency having little involvement after placement. None of it mattered. She had the confirmation she needed. Oliver Davis was her son. The house was larger than she expected, nestled in a quiet, affluent neighborhood. The Davis home sat at the end of a neatly paved cul-de-sac, Perfectly trimmed hedges lined the walkway, the lawn cut with surgical precision, not a single blade of grass out of place. Amelia stood outside the gate, fingers curling into her sleeves. She wasn't sure how long she had been there, 10 minutes, maybe 20, just staring, trying to steady herself. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she forced her feet forward. The doorbell chimed crisply, an elegant sound that didn't belong to a home that had ever known struggle. Footsteps. The door swung open. Helen Davis stood before her, a woman in her late 50s, dressed in a soft beige sweater and pearl earrings. She was poised, polished, the kind of woman who had spent decades molding herself into the perfect image of a suburban matriarch. She frowned slightly, her polite mask slipping into curious suspicion. "Can I help you?" Amelia swallowed. "I just need to talk to you about Oliver." For a split second, something flickered across Ross Helen's face, something quick, something guarded, then it was gone, replaced by a cool, practiced smile. "I don't see how that concerns you." Amelia's stomach tightened. She knew that tone, had heard it from social workers and attorneys, people who spoke in carefully chosen words designed to shut people like her out. She squared her shoulders. "Was he adopted?" Helen's fingers tightened on the door frame. There it was again, that flicker of something beneath the surface. But then, without hesitation, Helen lifted her chin and lied. "No." The single syllable landed like a slap. Amelia's breath hitched. "Lies." She stared at the woman, trying to process what kind of person could stand there and deny something so fundamental. "Are you sure?" Amelia pushed. "Because I have records that say otherwise." Helen's expression didn't waver. If anything, she looked bored now, like she had lost interest in the conversation entirely. "You must be mistaken," she said, not even blinking. Before Amelia could get another word in, Helen's hand shot out and the door slammed shut in her face. Amelia stood frozen on the porch, her breath shaking, her hands curled into fists. She had expected hesitation, resistance, but not outright denial. Why would they lie? What were they hiding? Oliver went home for dinner that night, just like he always did. The Davis estate was immaculate, a testament to wealth and control, a place where things were never out of order. The long dining table was already set when he arrived, candlelight reflecting off polished silverware. His mother Helen poured wine into their glasses with precise movements, while his father Robert sat at the head of the table, scanning something on his phone. It was all routine, but tonight something about it felt wrong. Oliver sat down, rolling his shoulders as tension that he couldn't quite explain settled in his chest. Halfway through dinner he spoke. "I had a strange encounter at the office today." Helen, slicing neatly into her steak, didn't look up. "Oh, there's this new cleaning lady," Oliver said, watching her closely. "She keeps looking at me like she knows me." The reaction was subtle, too subtle. Helen's knife paused, if only for a fraction of a second. Robert's grip on his wine glass tightened just enough for Oliver to notice. Helen recovered quickly, offering a polite, dismissive chuckle. "People admire you, Oliver. Maybe she's just intimidated." Oliver smirked, but there was no humor in it, right? Because everyone dreams of mopping floors for a living. Helen's lips pressed together in quiet disapproval, but she didn't comment. Instead, Oliver kept pushing. "She also asked me about my childhood," he said, twirling his fork between his fingers. "Wanted to know if I remembered anything from before I was 3 that got a reaction." Robert froze mid-sip, then set his glass down a little too carefully. Helen's expression didn't change, but her grip on the napkin in her lap tightened ever so slightly. "And what did you tell her?" she asked, voice controlled. Oliver shrugged. "That I don't remember much." He leaned back, watching them. "That's normal, right?" Silence. It lasted half a second too long. Helen recovered first, her smile unwavering. "Of course," she said smoothly. "You were a happy child. There was no need to dwell on the past." There it was again. That to perfect answer. A thought struck Oliver, one that he had never considered before. "Do we have any baby photos of me?" The tension in the room thickened instantly. Helen's reaction was immediate, but wrong, too quick, too rehearsed. "Oh, of course we have plenty. They're just in storage somewhere." Robert nodded stiffly. "Yes, they should be in the attic." Oliver didn't miss the tightness in his father's voice. He had lived in this house for years. He had never seen a single picture of himself as a newborn. His first memories were already of him as a small child, walking, talking, but before that nothing. Helen lifted her glass of wine honestly. "Oliver, why the sudden interest in this?" Oliver didn't answer because he didn't know. All he knew was that his parents were hiding something that night. Lying awake in bed, Oliver unlocked his phone. His mother's words echoed in his head. "Storage somewhere, the attic, too many excuses." His fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then, before he could overthink it, he typed New York adoption records, closed cases 25 years ago. Oliver stared at the search results, his pulse pounding. What if he wasn't who he thought he was? The night air was heavy, thick with the lingering scent of rain and the distant hum of the city. The Davis Financial Building loomed above Oliver, its glass facade reflecting the dim glow of street lights. He had stayed late, later than usual, his thoughts caught, assumed by something far more distracting than the quarterly reports stacked on his desk. His parents' reactions at dinner wouldn't leave his mind, the tightness in his mother's smile, the two quick reassurances, the blatant lie about baby photos. It didn't sit right, none of it did. For the first time in his life, Oliver questioned if his past was really what he had been told, and more than anything, he wondered if the cleaning lady Amelia knew something he didn't. As he exited the building, the usual meticulous order of his life felt strangely fragile. As if the foundation he stood on had cracked without him realizing it. His car was parked in the far lot where the street lights barely reached. His footsteps echoed softly in the quiet. The air smelled of damp asphalt, of gasoline and fading exhaust fumes. Then a sound, sharp, a screeching of tires. Oliver barely had time to register it before a voice cut through the night. Oliver, everything happened too fast. A blur of force slammed into him hard, knocking the breath from his lungs as he was thrown sideways. His shoulder hit the pavement, pain exploding through his body, headlights blinding, a car speeding straight past where he had just been standing. And then a sickening fed silence. For a moment everything was still, then his heart started again. Oliver shoved himself upright, his pulse hammering in his ears. His gaze darted to where the car had been, already gone, tires screeching around the corner, disappearing into the night. His chest heaved, trying to process the attack. But his thoughts derailed the moment his eyes landed on the figure crumpled on the pavement. His stomach dropped. Amelia, she lay motionless, her body twisted unnaturally, her face pale beneath the glow of the street lights. Blood pooled beneath her, a choked breath left Oliver's lips. No, he scrambled forward, hands shaking as he reached for her. Hey, his voice came out ragged, desperate. He pressed his hand to her shoulder, gently shaking her. Stay with me, okay? Amelia's eyelids fluttered, her lips parting slightly, but no sound came out. Oliver's breath hitched, his pulse roared in his ears, drowning out everything else. This woman, the one who had infuriated him, confused him, challenged him in ways no one else dared to, had just saved his life, and now she was bleeding out on the pavement. His fingers fumbled for his phone, slick with sweat. He barely registered the numbers as he punched them in. 911, what's your emergency? Oliver's throat was dry. There was an accident. He managed, his voice unsteady. A woman, she got hit. His eyes snapped back to Amelia's still form. His chest tightened. She had pushed him out of the way. She had taken the hit meant for him. Why? Oliver pressed his free hand against Amelia's wound, his mind racing. The paramedics were on their way, but all he could think was she knew something, and now she might not live to tell him. The hospital was too bright, too clean, too cold. The artificial lighting overhead buzzed, faintly reflecting off the linoleum floors in a sterile glow. Oliver sat in the waiting area, his suit still stained with Amelia's blood. The dried crimson on his cuffs felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else, but it didn't. He could still hear the screech of tires, the sickening thud, the way her body had collapsed onto the pavement. He could still see the blood pooling beneath her, the way her eyes flickered before shutting completely. She saved him, and now she was lying somewhere beyond those double doors, fighting for her life. He hated this, the waiting, the helplessness, the lack of control. He was used to knowing every variable, anticipating outcomes before they happened, but right now he knew nothing. A doctor in matey scrubs appeared, a clipboard tucked under her arm. Her expression was grave but measured, the kind of look that said she had delivered this news too many times before. Oliver shot to his feet. How is she? She's stable for now, the doctor said, but she lost a significant amount of blood. She flicked through her clipboard, her voice clipped and professional. We're out of her blood type in our current supply. We need a donor match. I'll do it. Oliver's response was immediate, his voice sharper than intended. The doctor hesitated. Are you certain? Yes. A nurse stepped forward to take him to get tested, but Oliver barely registered it. His thoughts were locked on Amelia, on why she did it. Minutes passed, then the nurse returned, a clipboard in hand. She looked uneasy. Mr. Davis, she said carefully, we have the results. Oliver nodded, impatient, and the nurse shifted uncomfortably. You're an exact match, he exhaled, already stepping forward. Great, then use my blood. But she didn't move. Oliver frowned when the nurse glanced at the chart again, her fingers tightening around the clipboard. That's unusual, she said slowly. Exact matches almost always happen between biological relatives. The floor tilted beneath him. Oliver's stomach knotted, his pulse pounded in his ears. No, his mother had said his whole life she had said that's impossible, Oliver said, but his voice didn't sound like his own. The nurse didn't argue, she just gave him a slow, pitying look. Then she walked away. Oliver sat frozen, his mind fracturing under the weight of realization. A match, a biological match. His mother's defensiveness at dinner, the missing baby photos, the way his parents always dodged questions about his infancy, and now this. His fingers trembled as he pulled out his phone. He needed answers. The phone rang once, twice. Helen picked up. Oliver, her voice was too careful. Oliver inhaled sharply, his grip tightening around the phone, his chest Felt like it was caving in him. I adopted silence. It stretched for too long, expanding like a chasm between them. Helen exhaled a long measured breath. Then finally, come home, we need to talk. Oliver's grip on his phone tightened. He didn't need to hear anything else. He had his answer. The drive home was a blur. Oliver barely remembered getting into his car, let alone navigating through the darkened streets toward the Davis estate. His mind was a relentless storm, thoughts crashing into each other with no space for clarity. His mother's voice still echoed in his ears. Come home, 2 words that said everything without saying anything at all. By the time he pulled up to the grand estate, his jaw was clenched so tightly it ached. The house loomed before him, just as PR and meticulously maintained as it had always been. The same expensive stonework, the same brand windows, but now it all felt hollow, like a well-decorated lie. Inside, the lights were dim, casting long, airy shadows across the furniture. His parents were already waiting. Helen sat on the leather patch of half-full glass of wine in her trembling hands. The faint clink of glass against her wedding ring was the only sound in the silent room. Robert sat beside her, his expression carefully neutral, but the deep furrow in his brow betrayed his unease. Neither of them spoke. They were waiting for him to start. Oliver didn't sit. He didn't need to. The weight pressing against his chest made it impossible to settle. Instead, he stood rigid, his voice low but crackling with restrained fury. Tell me. Helen inhaled sharply, but no words came out. It was Robert who finally spoke, his voice steady but tinged with something Oliver had never heard from him before. Hesitation. You were adopted. The confirmation should have felt like closure. It should have given him relief knowing the truth was finally laid bare. Instead, it felt like a physical blow. His whole life had just rewritten itself. Helen's fingers tightened around her glass as she set it down carefully, as if afraid she might drop it. We wanted to tell you, she said softly, her voice fragile, but you were so young. And then as you got older we didn't know how. Oliver let out a sharp, humorless laugh. So you just decided to never tell me, to pretend I was yours and let me live a lie? Helen flinched. We were pretending, Oliver, her voice cracked. You are ours. Don't. The word was a blade. Who were my real parents? Robert and Helen exchanged a glance. Helen's lips parted, then closed again, her throat bobbing as she swallowed hard. Finally she spoke. Your biological mother is the woman you've been working with. Oliver's entire body went still. Amelia Parker. His breath caught, his heart stopped for a moment. The room, the furniture, the very foundation beneath him ceased to exist. Amelia, the woman who had challenged him at work, the woman he had dismissed, argued with, resented, the woman who had saved his life. His mother. His vision swayed. He had to physically brace himself against the edge of the coffee table. How his voice faltered. He couldn't even finish the question. He swallowed down the lump rising in his throat and tried again. How long have you known? Helen looked away, shame pulling her shoulders inward. Since the day we adopted you. His breath shuddered. His whole life. They had known his whole life. Robert finally spoke, his voice cool. And even she was in no condition to raise a child. Oliver, she was an addict. She was broken. We were afraid she would come back and try to take you away. Oliver lifted his gaze, his blood running ice cold. So you erased her? His voice was horror, now thick with disbelief in something dangerously close to her. Betrayal. You erased my history because it was inconvenient. Helen covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Robert exhaled, rubbing his temples, but he didn't deny it. Oliver let out a shaky breath, his body rigid with emotions he didn't know how to process. Everything was a lie, everything. The name he had been given, the family he thought was his own, the history he had never been allowed to remember. And Amelia, his mother, had been right there the entire time. The anger surged too quickly, too violently for him to suppress it. He had to get out of here. Without another word he turned toward the door. Helen's voice broke behind him. Oliver, please. But he didn't look back. He couldn't. As he stepped outside, the cool night air did nothing to steady him. His hands trembled as he grabbed his keys. He had only one destination in mind, the hospital. Oliver had spent his whole life never thinking about the woman who gave birth to him, and yet here she was, Amelia Parker, his mother, lying in a hospital bed, pale and fragile, her body barely more than a silhouette beneath the sterile white sheets. His mother. The word felt foreign, wrong. Even he wasn't sure what to do with it, what it meant. Now that he knew the truth, Oliver took a hesitant step closer. The woman he had dismissed, the woman he had looked down on, had thrown herself in front of a car to save his life. And he had spent weeks treating her like she was nothing. His hands clenched into fists. He swallowed against the tightness in his throat and lowered himself into the chair beside her bed. You saved my life, he murmured, not expecting an answer. And I spent weeks treating you like you were nothing. He exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. His voice was hoarse. I didn't know. The room remained silent. The machines beeped. The slow rise and fall of Amelia's chest was the only sign that she was still here, still breathing. That a flicker of movement. Oliver sat up straight, his body stiff. He barely had time to process before her eyelids fluttered, her fingers twitching against the blanket. She inhaled, her breath unsteady, and then her eyes opened. Her gaze was unfocused at first, blinking again against the harsh hospital lights, but then they settled on his face, and she froze, a breath hitched in her throat, a whisper barely audible. Oliver. Oliver's chest tightened. He didn't know what to say, but his body moved. Before his mind could catch up, he reached forward and took her hand. Amelia sucked in a shaky breath, her fingers trembling, and as a million emotions flickered across her face: relief, disbelief, grief. She squeezed his hand tightly, as if she was afraid he might slip away. "I'm here," he said, voice quiet but firm, "and I know the truth." A tear slipped from Amelia's eye, trailing down her cheek, her lips parted as if she didn't quite believe it. "I thought I'd never get to see you again," she whispered. Oliver exhaled shakily. His voice cracked, and he had to clear his throat. He wasn't good at this, at vulnerability, at saying the things that needed to be said, but he had to ask. He had to know why. He asked, "Finally, why did you give me up?" Amelia's face crumpled. She blinked rapidly, as if trying to hold back the flood of emotions. Her grip on his hand never loosened. If anything, it tightened. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't have a choice." Oliver swallowed hard. "Tell me." And she did. She told him everything: the addiction, the courts, the helplessness of watching him be taken from her arms, the years she spent getting clean, clawing her way back from rock bottom, the nights she lay awake wondering if he was safe, if he was loved. "I wanted to be better for you," she said, her voice trembling. "I fought so hard, but by the time I was ready you were already gone." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I didn't know where to look, and when I found you, you didn't know me." Oliver clenched his jaw, his throat burning. She had searched for him all this time. She had been trying, and he had looked at her like she was beneath him. His stomach twisted painfully. He had spent years resenting people who never deserved his anger, his parents who lied to protect him, Amelia who gave him up to save him, and himself for never seeing the truth until it was nearly too late. He didn't know if he could forgive everything, but he did know one thing: he couldn't lose her, not again. Oliver exhaled slowly, his grip on her hand tightening. "You don't have to look anymore," he said softly. "I'm right here." The Davis home had never felt so unfamiliar. For years it had been a symbol of stability in Oliver's life, pristine, predictable, a place where every meal was served on time, every conversation measured, every moment carefully curated. But tonight there was something different in the air. For the first time Oliver had invited Amelia to dinner. A week had passed since she had been discharged from the hospital, and in that time Oliver had wrestled with everything: there lies, the revelations, the weight of an entire past he never knew existed. His parents had raised him, loved him, shaped him into the man he had become, but Amelia had given him life. There was no easy way to reconcile that, no simple way to piece everything together. But as he stood outside his childhood home with Amelia beside him, he knew this was the first step. Helen Davis answered the door. For a moment she just stared. Her expression flickered with something unreadable, something cautious, something bordering on relief. Behind her Robert stood stiff as always, his arms crossed, his posture guarded, but there was no hostility. Oliver took a breath. "Mom, Dad." His voice was steady, but beneath it was something vulnerable. He stepped aside slightly, revealing Amelia standing just behind him. Helen's breath caught in her throat, her fingers tightening on the doorknob, but she didn't look away. Amelia stood still, her gaze uncertain. She wasn't sure if she belonged here, if she was overstepping. The last time she had stood outside this house she had been met with a slammed door. Helen swallowed, then stepped aside. "Come." In Amelia's exhale was almost imperceptible, but Oliver caught it. She stepped forward, crossing the threshold, entering the home where her son had been raised by another woman. The air smelled of roasted chicken, warm bread, fresh herbs. It was a home-cooked meal, the kind of dinner meant to comfort and welcome, the kind of meal Amelia never had growing up. They made their way to the dining table, and it wasn't until they sat that Amelia noticed at the extra chair. It was a small gesture one most wouldn't even think twice about, but to her it meant everything. Dinner began in silence. At first no one spoke beyond murmured pleasantries. The clinking of silverware against plates was the loudest sound in the room. The tension wasn't hostile, but it was thick, uncertain, and then Robert cleared his throat. "I should say something," he said, his voice rough. He looked straight at Amelia, his expression unreadable. "I don't know what I expected when I first heard your name again." Amelia set her fork down, her hands trembling slightly beneath the table. "I spent years being afraid of this." Robert admitted. "Afraid of what you meant, what you might take away?" Oliver tensed. Helen said nothing, only watching her husband, but Robert continued, his voice lower, more careful. "I realized something the night you pushed Oliver out of the way of that car." His fingers tapped against the table, a nervous habit. "You weren't here to take anything, you were here because you care." Amelia's breath hitched. She hadn't expected this. Robert nodded once, as if to himself. "So for what it's worth, thank you not For giving him up, not for leaving him but for making sure he got here to us. Amelia didn't know what to say. She blinked rapidly, willing away the stain of tears. Then with a quiet, almost whispered voice, she answered, "You took care of him. I should be thanking you." For the first time that evening, Robert smiled. Helen, who had been silent, finally spoke. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice softer than Oliver had heard in weeks. "For that day you came to our house, I should have listened to you." Amelia met her gaze, and for the first time she didn't see a woman trying to erase her. She saw a mother. "It's all right," Amelia murmured. Helen shook her head. "No, it wasn't, and I see that now." She hesitated, then added, "I didn't know how to face you. I was terrified that if you ever showed up, I'd lose him." She looked at Oliver, her voice thick with emotion. "But I never lost him, did I?" Oliver felt something in his chest loosen. He looked between the two women, one who had raised him, the other who had given him life. They weren't enemies. They weren't fighting over him. They were two parts of the same story. At some point the conversation drifted into lighter territory. Helen recounted childhood stories, ones Amelia had never heard before. He was convinced at age 5 that he could run the world. She laughed, casting Oliver a teasing glance. Tried to fire his kindergarten teacher because she wouldn't let him have extra playtime. Amelia let out a quiet laugh, picturing it perfectly. "Sounds about right." Oliver groaned. "Do we really need to do this?" Robert smirked. "You're the one who invited her, and for the first time in weeks, maybe months." Oliver laughed. The night continued, and by the time the meal ended something had changed. The tension had eased. There were still wounds that needed healing, still years of distance that could never be erased. But there was something new now, a bridge, a connection. As Amelia stood to leave, Oliver instinctively stood with her. He walked her to the door. Lingering at the threshold, she looked up at him, uncertain. "Thank you for tonight." He hesitated, then said something softer than she had ever heard from him. "You don't have to leave so soon." Her breath caught. She smiled, but it was small, hopeful. Another time Oliver nodded, accepting that, and then just before she stepped outside he said, "A good night, Mom." Amelia froze, her eyes widened, her breath hitching. For a moment she didn't move, but then her lips trembled, and she nodded quickly as if afraid she'd break down if she did anything more. "Good night, sweetheart." Helen and Robert stood in the doorway watching. Amelia glanced at them, something unspoken passing between them, and as she stepped outside for the first time in 25 years, it wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed this story, give this video a like if you haven't already, and subscribe for more.